Racist teacher fails Muslim student, then learns her dad owns the school district. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The classroom was silent, the tension hanging in the air so thick that even the students who usually whispered in the back of the room sat motionless. All eyes were on Amina, who sat frozen in her seat, staring up at the front of the room where Mrs. Calloway stood, holding up a large red-inked F on Amina's latest exam. Amina felt her stomach drop. She had studied for this test more than any other student in the class. She had spent weeks preparing, staying up late after finishing chores at home, reading through textbooks, writing notes, and solving problems over and over again until she understood every detail. Yet here she was. Another F. Another mark against her future. Mrs. Calloway's lips curled into a smirk, and she let out a dramatic sigh. "Amina," she said, shaking her head in mock disappointment. "It's unfortunate, really. You just can't seem to grasp the material, can you?" Amina clenched her hands into fists beneath the desk, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had done everything right. She had answered every question carefully. But deep down, she already knew this wasn't about her knowledge. This was about who she was. She had noticed it for months now, the way Mrs. Calloway always called on her first, challenging her answers with a condescending tone even when she was correct. The way the teacher would praise other students for answers she had given moments before, completely ignoring her. The way her grades were always just low enough to keep her off the honor roll, even though she knew she was performing just as well as the top students. At first, Amina thought she was imagining it. She had wanted to believe that maybe she wasn't working hard enough, that maybe she needed to push herself even further. But then she started to notice how her friend Layla, another Muslim student who wore a hijab like hers, received the same treatment. And now, staring at the big red F in front of her, she knew. This wasn't about failing a test. This was about being silenced. The class remained silent, waiting for Amina to say something, to protest, to fight back. But what was the point? Mrs. Calloway held all the power in this room, and Amina was just a student. Amina swallowed hard and forced her voice to remain calm. "I studied for this test," she said, barely above a whisper. "I know I got those answers right." Mrs. Calloway let out a fake laugh. "Oh, Amina, sweetie," she said, her voice dripping with false kindness. "It's not about studying. Some people just don't have the natural intelligence for this subject." The words stung like a slap. Amina felt her cheeks burn, but before she could speak, someone else did. "That's not true." The voice came from the back of the room. "Layla." Amina turned to see her best friend sitting up straight, her jaw clenched. "Amina studies more than anyone here," Layla said firmly. "She helps me with homework all the time. If she got an F, then something isn't right." A few other students murmured in agreement, and Amina could see them exchanging uncertain glances. They had all noticed it too, the unfair way Mrs. Calloway treated certain students. Mrs. Calloway's eyes flashed with irritation. "Oh please," she scoffed. "This is a merit-based classroom. You get what you earn." If Amina's answers were incorrect, then I'm afraid she simply didn't meet the standard. Amina's nails dug into her palms. She wasn't about to let this happen again. Not this time. Taking a steady breath, she forced herself to meet Mrs. Calloway's gaze. "Then let's go over the test together," she said. "Right here in front of the class." The room went silent. Mrs. Calloway's expression shifted. For a brief second, there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before she quickly covered it up with a tight-lipped smile. "That won't be necessary," she said coolly. "Besides, class is almost over. If you have concerns, you can take it up after school." Amina knew exactly what that meant. A brush-off. A way to make sure this conversation never saw the light of day. She wasn't going to let that happen. Before she could argue, the bell rang. Mrs. Calloway smiled sweetly. "Well, class dismissed. Amina, I expect you to try harder next time." The students around her hesitated before slowly gathering their things, casting glances at Amina as they left. Amina stayed seated, gripping the edges of her desk, her pulse racing. She had worked too hard for this. She wasn't going to let her future be stolen. As she packed up her books, Layla leaned over. "You're not letting this go, right?" she asked in a low voice. Amina set her jaw. Absolutely not. She had one person she could call. And when he found out what had happened, Mrs. Calloway was in for the shock of her life. Amina stormed out of the classroom, her heart pounding with frustration. She gripped her backpack straps tightly as she made her way through the crowded hallway, students bustling around her, their voices blending into an unintelligible hum. She barely noticed any of it. Layla was right behind her, struggling to keep up with Amina's fast pace. "Okay, tell me you're going to do something about this," she said. Amina exhaled sharply, trying to calm the storm brewing inside her. "I'm calling my dad," she said, pulling her phone from her pocket. Layla's eyes widened. "Oh," she murmured. "Mrs. Calloway has no idea what's coming?" Amina's father, Dr. Karim Abbas, wasn't just any concerned parent. He was the superintendent of the entire school district. He had spent years working his way up in the education system, ensuring fair policies and advocating for underprivileged students. He believed in equal opportunities for every child, regardless of their background. And now, Amina was about to tell him that one of his own teachers was failing his daughter out of prejudice. She pressed the call button and put the phone to her ear. It rang twice before his familiar deep voice answered. "Amina, Habibti, what's wrong?" Amina inhaled sharply, steadying herself. "Baba, I need you to come to school. Now." There was a pause on the other end. "Are you okay?" His tone immediately shifted, filled with concern. "I'm fine," Amina said. "But I just got my test back from Mrs. Calloway, and she failed me on purpose." Silence. Then, in a calm but serious tone, he asked, "You're sure?" Amina nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "I studied for this test. I know I got those answers right. And when I asked to go over it in front of the class, she shut me down. It's not just this test either, Baba. She's been targeting me all year. And I'm not the only one. Layla's had the same experience." Layla leaned in closer, listening intently. Dr. Abbas sighed heavily on the other end. "Okay," he said firmly. "I'm on my way." Amina felt a sense of relief wash over her. If there was one person who wouldn't let this slide, it was her father. She ended the call and turned to Layla. "He's coming?" Layla let out a low whistle. Mrs. Calloway picked the wrong student to mess with? Amina smirked, though the anger still simmered beneath her skin. She really did. The two of them made their way to the front office, where Amina knew her father would arrive soon. She didn't have to wait long. Within 20 minutes, a black sedan pulled up outside the school. Her father stepped out, his presence commanding the moment he entered the building. He was a tall man with a confident posture, wearing his usual dark suit. His expression was calm, but Amina knew better. He was furious. A receptionist looked up as he approached. "Dr. Abbas," she greeted, standing up immediately. "Is there a problem?" "There is," he said smoothly. "I need to speak to the principal. Now." The receptionist nodded quickly, picking up the phone. "Of course. One moment." Amina and Layla exchanged glances. This was happening. Within minutes, they were ushered into the principal's office. Mr. Dawson, the school principal, was seated behind his desk, clearly caught off guard by Dr. Abbas's sudden appearance. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Dr. Abbas, this is unexpected. How can I help you?" Dr. Abbas didn't waste time. "I'm here because my daughter has been unfairly targeted by one of your teachers." Mr. Dawson's eyebrows raised. "Excuse me?" Amina took a deep breath. "Mrs. Calloway has been failing me on purpose. I studied for this test, I know I got the answers right, and she refused to go over it in front of the class. This isn't the first time either." Mr. Dawson frowned. "That's a serious accusation." Dr. Abbas leaned forward slightly, his tone measured but firm. "Which is why I want the test reviewed immediately. I want another teacher, preferably the head of the department, to regrade it. If my daughter truly failed, then fine. But if she didn't?" He let the unfinished sentence hang in the air, his meaning clear. The principal's expression faltered slightly. Of course we can arrange that," he said hesitantly. "I'd like it done today," Dr. Abbas added. Mr. Dawson nodded quickly. "Absolutely. Let me call Mrs. Calloway and so we can discuss this." Amina stiffened. She hadn't expected to face her teacher this soon. Layla nudged her. "This is going to be good." Minutes later, the door opened and Mrs. Calloway walked in. The moment she saw Dr. Abbas sitting beside Amina, her expression changed. For a split second, there was a flicker of panic before she smoothed her face into polite neutrality. "Ah, Dr. Abbas," she said, offering a tight smile. "I wasn't expecting you." "No, you weren't," he said. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. She sat down stiffly, glancing at Mr. Dawson. "What's this about?" Mr. Dawson cleared his throat. "Mrs. Calloway, Amina has raised concerns about her grade on the last exam. Dr. Abbas has requested that the test be reviewed by another teacher." Mrs. Calloway's jaw tightened slightly. "Well, I can assure you her grade is accurate." Dr. Abbas turned to Mr. Dawson. Then there shouldn't be a problem with having another teacher regrade it? For a moment there was silence. Mrs. Calloway's lips pressed together, and Amina could see the tension in her posture. She didn't want this to happen, because she knew. She knew exactly what she had done, and now she was trapped. Mr. Dawson nodded. "I'll call the head of the department now." Mrs. Calloway sat rigidly, saying nothing. Amina felt her pulse quicken. This was it, the moment of truth. And Mrs. Calloway had nowhere to hide. Mrs. Calloway sat frozen, her fingers gripping the arms of the chair as Mr. Dawson picked up the phone. The silence in the room stretched, tension thickening with every second. Amina could see it now, the way Mrs. Calloway's confidence wavered, the realization that she no longer had the power in this situation. Mr. Dawson cleared his throat and spoke into the phone. "Dr. Reynolds? Yes, I need you to come to my office. We have a grading review situation that requires your attention." Mrs. Calloway's knuckles turned white as she forced a polite smile. "Mr. Dawson, I'm sure this is unnecessary. I grade my students fairly, and I don't see the need to waste Dr. Reynolds' time." Dr. Abbas didn't even look at her. If there's nothing to hide, then there's nothing to worry about. Amina saw a flicker of something in Mrs. Calloway's eyes. Fear. Moments later, the door swung open and Dr. Reynolds, the head of the math department, walked in, his glasses perched on the edge of his nose. He was known for being fair but strict, the kind of teacher who didn't tolerate injustice. He glanced around the room, his sharp eyes settling on Mrs. Calloway. "What's going on?" Mr. Dawson gestured toward Amina. Amina believed she was unfairly graded on her exam, and Dr. Abbas has requested an immediate re-evaluation of her answers. Dr. Reynolds extended his hand. "Let me see the test." Mrs. Calloway hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, with stiff movements, she opened her folder, pulled out Amina's exam and handed it over. Dr. Reynolds adjusted his glasses and began flipping through the pages. The only sound in the room was the soft rustle of papers as his pen moved swiftly, making notes in the margins. Amina sat still, her heart pounding. Everyone was watching. Mrs. Calloway kept her gaze on her lap, her expression unreadable. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Reynolds set the test down. "This exam was graded incorrectly," he said, his voice firm. Amina exhaled sharply, relief flooding through her. Layla squeezed her arm. "I knew it," she whispered. Dr. Reynolds tapped his pen against the paper. "Amina's answers are almost entirely correct. She should have received at least a 92%, not an F." He turned to Mrs. Calloway, his expression unreadable. "How do you explain this?" Mrs. Calloway paled. "It must have been an oversight," she said quickly. "I grade a lot of exams and mistakes happen." Dr. Abbas leaned forward. "A mistake?" he echoed, his voice dangerously calm. "Is that what we're calling it?" Mrs. Calloway flinched. Dr. Reynolds glanced between them, his brows furrowing. "I find it hard to believe that this was an accident. These aren't simple grading errors. Amina's correct answers were marked as wrong. That suggests intentional tampering." Amina swallowed hard, her stomach twisting. She had known it, but hearing it confirmed by another teacher made it real. Mr. Dawson sighed, rubbing his temples. "Mrs. Calloway, this is a serious issue. If these accusations are true..." "They're not." Mrs. Calloway interrupted, panic creeping into her voice. "I would never target a student." Dr. Abbas didn't look convinced. He turned to Mr. Dawson. "How many complaints have you received about Mrs. Calloway's grading?" Mr. Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "There have been a few." Dr. Abbas' expression hardened. "And have they all come from students of a particular background?" Silence. Amina saw the realization dawn in Mr. Dawson's eyes. He had likely dismissed complaints before, never fully investigating them. Now he had no choice. Mrs. Calloway squared her shoulders as if grasping for control. "I have been teaching for over 15 years. You think I would risk my career over a single student?" Dr. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. "It's not just one student, is it?" Mrs. Calloway had no answer. Mr. Dawson sighed. "Given the circumstances, I have no choice but to place you on administrative leave pending an investigation." Mrs. Calloway's face went red. "You're suspending me? Over this nonsense?" "This nonsense," Dr. Abbas said sharply, "is about a student's future. About the integrity of this school." He looked at Mr. Dawson. "I'll expect a full report on all of Mrs. Calloway's grading practices." Mrs. Calloway stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. She turned to Amina, eyes flashing. "I hope you're happy," she spat. Amina met her gaze, steady and unwavering. "I will be." When I get the grade I earned? For the first time, Mrs. Calloway had nothing to say. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the office. A heavy silence settled over the room before Dr. Reynolds spoke. "We'll correct Amina's grade today?" Dr. Abbas gave a satisfied nod. "That's all I wanted." Amina felt something deep inside her, a weight she had carried for months, finally lift. She had fought back. And she had won. The walk out of the principal's office felt different, lighter. As if Amina had shed a weight she didn't even realize had been pressing down on her shoulders. She had fought for herself, and she had won. Layla walked beside her, whispering under her breath, "I swear, I thought Mrs. Calloway was about to faint back there." Amina let out a soft chuckle. She almost did. They reached the hallway where students had already started talking. Word spread fast in school, and judging by the looks Amina was getting, people had heard. Some students offered her subtle nods of approval, others whispered excitedly among themselves. She had gone up against a teacher. And she hadn't just won for herself, she had won for every student who had been treated unfairly. Layla nudged her. "Hey, I bet the school paper is gonna be all over this." Amina sighed. "Great. Just what I need." Layla grinned. "Come on, you deserve some recognition. You literally got a teacher suspended." Amina didn't respond because at that moment she saw something that made her pause. In the distance, Mrs. Calloway was standing near the faculty lounge, her arms crossed, speaking in hushed tones with another teacher. Even from here, Amina could see the frustration on her face. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second. Mrs. Calloway's expression hardened and then, just like that, she turned and walked away. For months she had controlled Amina's future. But not anymore. This time Amina held the power. She turned back to Layla. "Let's get to class." Layla smirked. "You're officially a legend." Amina shook her head, but deep down she knew this wasn't just about her. Mrs. Calloway wasn't the only teacher who treated students unfairly. This wasn't just one isolated incident, it was part of a bigger problem. And if Amina had learned anything from this experience, it was that she wasn't going to stay silent anymore. Not now. Not ever. That evening, as Amina sat at the dinner table, her father placed a hand on hers. "I'm proud of you," he said softly. She looked up at him. "For what?" "For standing up for yourself," Dr. Abbas replied. "For knowing your worth. Not everyone has the courage to do that." Amina smiled. "I guess I learned from the best." Dr. Abbas chuckled. "That you did?" Amina exhaled, finally feeling at peace. She had always known she deserved better. And now, so did everyone else. It had been a few weeks since the confrontation with Mrs. Calloway, and the school felt different. Not just for Amina but for everyone. Students who had once been hesitant to speak up about unfair treatment were finding their voices. Mrs. Calloway had been placed on administrative leave, pending a full investigation. In the meantime, a substitute teacher had taken over her class, a teacher who actually cared. Amina had walked into her math class expecting tension, but instead, she was met with a genuine willingness to teach. And the best part? Her grade had been corrected. A crisp, printed report card now showed an A, proving what she had known all along: she had never deserved to fail. Layla leaned against the lockers, scanning Amina's report card. "I still can't believe she thought she could get away with it." Amina shrugged. "She did get away with it. For years." Layla frowned. "Yeah. Until you." Amina exhaled. "I just hope this means no one else has to go through what I did." As they walked through the hallways, something unusual happened. Students started greeting her. People she had never spoken to before nodded in acknowledgement, some whispered words of encouragement. She had become more than a student. She had become a symbol of change. Even the faculty seemed different. Teachers who had once looked the other way were now being careful, aware that students were watching. And it wasn't just Amina. More students were asking questions, challenging unfair grades, demanding fairness. Amina knew she hadn't just won a battle for herself, she had started something bigger. That afternoon, as she packed up her things, the principal's voice came over the loudspeaker. "Attention students. We will be holding a special assembly tomorrow morning regarding fairness and academic integrity. We encourage all students to attend." Amina and Layla exchanged looks. Layla grinned. "That's because of you." Amina shook her head, but she couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride. She had changed something. And she wasn't stopping here. As she stepped outside, the sun felt warmer, brighter. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. And she knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Amina woke up feeling different. Not just lighter but stronger. Today's assembly wasn't just any school event. It was a direct result of what she had fought for. She dressed quickly, smoothing her hijab as she glanced at herself in the mirror. There was a new confidence in her reflection, a quiet strength she hadn't noticed before. She had always been determined, hardworking, and resilient, but now she was also a force of change. At breakfast, her father was already sipping his coffee, scrolling through his phone. He glanced up and smiled. "Big day?" Amina nodded. "Yeah. The school's having an assembly about fairness." Dr. Abbas leaned back, pleased. "Good. That means they're taking this seriously." Amina hesitated, then asked, "Do you think it'll actually change anything?" Her father studied her for a moment before answering. "You already changed something, Amina. One step at a time." She thought about that as she made her way to school. Had she really changed something? When she stepped through the front doors, she got her answer. The hallways were buzzing. Students were gathered in small groups, whispering, speculating. Some looked excited. Others, nervous. Layla was waiting by their lockers. "You're officially the most talked about person in this school." Amina groaned. "That's not exactly what I wanted." Layla smirked. "Well, too late. You're the face of student justice now." Amina rolled her eyes, but she couldn't deny that something felt different. There was an energy in the air, a sense of anticipation. As the bell rang, the principal's voice echoed over the speakers. "All students, please proceed to the auditorium for this morning's assembly." Amina's stomach twisted. This was it. She followed the crowd into the large auditorium, the chatter growing louder. The room filled quickly, with students settling into rows while teachers stood along the walls. At the front of the stage stood Principal Dawson, Dr. Reynolds, and a few other faculty members. And then, to Amina's shock, her father walked onto the stage. She turned to Layla. "I didn't know he was coming." Layla raised an eyebrow. "Oh, this just got a lot more interesting." The microphone crackled as Principal Dawson cleared his throat. "Good morning, everyone. As you all know, fairness and integrity are the foundation of any good school. We are here today to address some serious concerns that have been brought to our attention." The murmurs in the audience grew louder. Amina could feel the weight of every gaze, even though no one had said her name outright. Principal Dawson continued. "We recently conducted an internal review regarding certain grading policies. What we found was concerning." A hush fell over the room. For years, some students have felt unheard. That changes today. Amina sat up straighter. Dr. Reynolds stepped forward. "Effective immediately, all grading disputes will be subject to departmental review. No teacher will have unchecked authority over a student's academic future." There was a collective murmur among the students. Layla leaned in. "That's because of you." Amina's heart pounded. This was real change. Then her father took the microphone. "As the superintendent, my job is to ensure that every student in this district has an equal opportunity to succeed. Discrimination has no place in education." Amina saw some of the teachers shift uncomfortably. Dr. Abbas continued. "We are also implementing a confidential reporting system. Any student who believes they have been unfairly treated can report it directly to the administration, without fear of retaliation." A wave of relief swept through the students. One of the seniors in the front row raised a hand. "Does this mean teachers can get fired if they're caught doing this?" Principal Dawson hesitated, then nodded. "If an investigation proves wrongdoing, there will be consequences. No one is exempt." A ripple of excitement spread through the audience. For years, students had felt powerless. Not anymore. The assembly continued, with faculty answering more questions, but Amina could barely focus, because for the first time she felt heard. After the assembly, students flooded the halls, still buzzing with energy. Amina was just about to head to class when she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned and froze. Mrs. Calloway stood there. Her former teacher looked different. The arrogance was gone, replaced with something almost uncertain. "I need to speak with you," Mrs. Calloway said. Amina hesitated, then nodded. "Okay." They stepped to the side, away from the crowd. Mrs. Calloway folded her arms, her gaze flickering downward. "I wanted to say," she exhaled sharply. "I made a mistake." Amina raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" Mrs. Calloway's lips pressed together. "I let my biases cloud my judgment. And for that, I'm sorry." Silence stretched between them. Amina had imagined this moment so many times. But now that it was happening, she felt nothing. Because she didn't need an apology. She had already won. Amina nodded. "I hope you mean that." Mrs. Calloway looked down. "I do." Without another word, she turned and walked away. Amina stood there for a moment, watching her go. Layla appeared beside her. Whoa, did that just happen? Amina sighed. Yeah. Layla studied her. And? Amina shrugged. And? I'm moving forward. Layla grinned. Good. Because you just changed this school forever? Amina let that sink in. She had stood up for herself. She had forced change. And she had proven that one voice could make a difference. As she walked to class, the whispers around her had changed. No longer about failure, but about power. Her power. And she wasn't going to stop using it. Not now. Not ever. It had been a week since the assembly, and Amina could still feel the impact it had left on the school. The atmosphere had shifted. Students weren't just accepting things as they were anymore. They were asking questions, challenging unfair treatment, and standing up for themselves. Walking through the halls, Amina noticed subtle changes. Teachers who once carried unchecked authority now watched their words carefully. Students who had once been afraid to speak out now felt empowered. And most importantly, fairness was being taken seriously. Layla fell into step beside her. So, have you seen the school paper? Amina groaned. I was hoping to avoid it. Layla laughed and pulled a folded newspaper from her bag, flipping it open dramatically. One student stands up, changes the system. That's you, by the way. Amina winced. That's dramatic? Layla grinned. You literally forced an investigation, got a biased teacher suspended, and changed school policy. What did you think was going to happen? Amina exhaled. I don't know. I didn't do it for attention. Layla softened. I know. But that's what makes it even more important. As they turned the corner, a younger student, probably a freshman, hurried up to them. She looked nervous but determined. Amina? She asked hesitantly. Amina stopped. Yeah? The girl glanced around as if making sure no one else was listening. I just wanted to say, thank you. Amina blinked. For what? The girl swallowed. For standing up to Mrs. Calloway. I had her last year and she made me feel like I wasn't smart enough. Like I didn't belong here. But when I saw what you did, it made me realize I wasn't the problem. Amina felt a lump rise in her throat. She had been so caught up in fighting her own battle that she hadn't fully grasped how many others had been struggling too. Amina offered a small smile. You do belong here. And if anyone ever makes you feel otherwise, you fight back. The girl nodded, relief evident on her face. I will. Thanks. She hurried off, disappearing into the crowd. Amina exhaled. Wow. Layla bumped her shoulder. See? You didn't just change things for yourself. You changed things for everyone. Amina let those words settle. She had never set out to be a leader. She had never imagined herself as someone others would look up to. But now she understood something important. Change doesn't start with loud speeches or grand actions. It starts with one person refusing to stay silent. And she had been that person. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the next class, Amina felt something new settle in her chest. Pride. Not just in herself, but in what she had started. And deep down she knew. This was just the beginning. It had been a few months since Amina's fight for fairness changed the school's academic policies, but the effects continued to ripple through every classroom, every hallway, and every conversation. Students were more confident, more aware of their rights, and more willing to challenge things that didn't seem fair. The administration had even begun holding monthly student meetings, where concerns about bias and discrimination could be raised without fear of retaliation. And Amina? She had settled back into her studies, enjoying the simple joy of learning again, without the constant fear of being unfairly graded. One afternoon, as she packed her books into her bag, she received an email notification on her phone. It was from Principal Dawson. She hesitated, her heart pounding slightly. Subject, a special request. Curious, she opened it. Dear Amina, we've been incredibly impressed with your leadership and courage over the past few months. Because of your efforts, this school is in a much better place. We'd like to invite you to join the District Student Advisory Council, where you'd have the opportunity to represent students and help shape policies at an even greater level. Please let me know if you'd be interested. Amina stared at the screen. The Student Advisory Council? That was a big deal. It was a small, select group of students from different schools in the district, working directly with administrators to influence school policies. She had never imagined herself being part of something like that. But now she realized she had something powerful, a voice. And maybe, just maybe, she could use it to keep making a difference. Layla, who had been watching her from across the table, raised an eyebrow. Okay, what's up? You look like you just got asked to meet the president. Amina grinned and turned the phone toward her. Layla's eyes widened as she read the email. Then she let out a loud gasp. No way. This is huge. Amina laughed. I know. But do you think I should do it? Layla gave her a look. Do you even hear yourself? Of course you should do it. You fought for change and now they're asking you to keep fighting on an even bigger level. If you say no, I swear I will personally drag you to that meeting. Amina chuckled, but deep down she already knew her answer. She was going to do it. Because this wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student who ever felt silenced. Every student who thought they didn't have power. She hit reply. Principal Dawson, thank you for this opportunity. I would love to be a part of the Student Advisory Council. Let me know when the first meeting is. As soon as she hit send, a weight lifted off her shoulders. She had started something incredible. And she wasn't stopping now. As she and Layla left the school building that day, Amina glanced back at the halls she had once walked through in frustration and silence. Now they were halls of change. And she had helped make that happen. Amina sat in the large conference room, surrounded by students from schools across the district. The Student Advisory Council meeting had just begun, and for the first time she realized just how big this opportunity was. At the front of the room sat superintendents, principals, and board members, all listening as students shared their concerns. Real concerns. Everything from unfair grading policies to bullying prevention was on the agenda. And when it was Amina's turn to speak, she didn't hesitate. She stood, cleared her throat, and told her story. How she had been unfairly graded. How she had fought back. How she had exposed a system that punished students for things beyond their control. The room was silent as she spoke. Even the adults, some of whom had likely ignored these issues before, listened. Really listened. And when she finished, they applauded. Dr. Reynolds, the math department head, was among the panelists. He looked at her with genuine respect. Amina, your courage in speaking out has already created change. But tell us, what else do you think we should do? Amina exhaled, gathering her thoughts. She had so many ideas. For starters, we need a more transparent grading system. If a student fails, they should have the right to see exactly why, without being dismissed by a teacher. There should also be mandatory bias training for teachers so we don't keep running into the same issues. A few adults exchanged glances, clearly caught off guard. Amina continued, her voice unwavering. And we need more student involvement in decision-making. We're the ones who experience these policies firsthand. We should have a seat at the table, not just when things go wrong but all the time. Another student chimed in. She's right. A lot of the time decisions are made for us but not with us. That needs to change. A superintendent took notes. These are excellent points. We'll discuss how to implement some of these ideas moving forward. Layla, who was sitting beside Amina, whispered, You're actually changing things. Again, Amina smiled. This wasn't just a fight against one teacher anymore. This was systemic change. And she was at the center of it. Over the next few months, things really did change. A new grading appeal process was introduced, allowing students to challenge unfair grades through an unbiased review board. Mandatory anti-discrimination training was rolled out for teachers across the district. And best of all, Amina became one of the first students ever to be given a permanent advisory role in the district's academic policy meetings. She had gone from being silenced to being heard, from being dismissed to making decisions. One voice, one stand, and everything was different now. As she walked through the school halls, students greeted her with smiles. Some still whispered, but not in the way they used to. Now, she wasn't just another student. She was proof that change was possible. And she was just getting started. Amina sat at her desk, scrolling through emails when a new message popped up. Subject: Invitation to speak at the statewide education conference. Her breath hitched. The statewide education conference? That was a huge platform, an event attended by educators, policymakers, and student leaders from across the state. She clicked on the email, reading through the invitation. Dear Amina, we have been following your incredible work in advocating for academic fairness and student rights. Your efforts have sparked meaningful changes, not just in your school but across the district. We would be honored if you would join us as a guest speaker at the upcoming statewide education conference to share your story and insights. Let us know if you're interested. Amina stared at the screen, her heart pounding. This was unreal. Her father, sitting across the room, noticed her stunned expression. What's wrong? She turned the laptop toward him. I just got invited to speak at a state conference. Dr. Abbas's eyes widened slightly before his lips curled into a proud smile. Amina, that's incredible. She shook her head in disbelief. I never thought it would go this far. Her father leaned forward. When you stand up for what's right, it's never just about one person. It's about inspiring others to do the same. Amina exhaled, letting those words sink in. Then, with newfound determination, she typed her response. I would be honored to speak at the conference. Thank you for this opportunity. She hit send. This journey had started with one unfair test grade, one act of injustice. And now, it was leading her to something bigger than she ever imagined. She had fought not just for herself, but for every student who had ever been silenced. And she would keep fighting. Because one voice could create a ripple. And she was proof that a ripple could become a wave. As she closed her laptop, she felt it, the weight of change, the power of courage, and the unstoppable momentum of justice. This was only the beginning. And she was ready.